Thank you for attending our inaugural event this evening to celebrate Black History Month and our Black History Month speaker series. Before I introduce our guests, let me introduce myself. My name is Charlotta Green, and I am one of the graduate assistants here at the Graduate School of Education and Psychology at Pepperdine University and to our Center for Global Partnerships and Learning, where I'm a graduate assistant. The center provides GSEP students with a myriad of services ranging from publication support, certificate programs, access to GSEP's academic journal, and a few other services. It is through the center that we bring you tonight's programming, which is the first in a series of speaker events scheduled to celebrate Black History Month. And we'll tell you a little more about the rest of our speakers at the end of the evening. With that, let me introduce our guest tonight. Dr. Tamara Lewis is a professor of the practice of historical theology and the director of Black Africana Studies program at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. She received her Ph.D. in religion and history from Vanderbilt University. She is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church and serves on the board of the African American Heritage Center for the United Methodist Church. She is an editorial board member of the Methodist Review. She is an author of several journal articles and essays in edited volumes, and a member of the steering committee of the Women and Religion Unit of the American Academy of Religion. Dr. Lewis is presently completing 2 books on race and theology in early modern England and in early American Methodism, and we look forward to that. Dr. Lewis and I are both colleagues in the United Methodist Church, and so I am so excited to introduce her tonight. And now the next voice you'll hear is Dr. Tamara Lewis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Please let me express my gratitude to Pepperdine University Graduate School of Education and Psychology for allowing me this gracious opportunity to share a message on Black history, cultural race theory, and the American separation of church and state. Special thanks goes out to Reverend Charlotta Green for this wonderful invitation, and also Dr. Asaya Gazi, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, for all of your wonderful assistance, and to all of your team, welcome and greetings to all. Black hands felled the forest, that patient humble folk did lay the steel for railroads and bear the tyrant's yoke. On every field of battle, with true and loyal heart, they've saved our country's honor and nobly done their part. For it took true heroism to make this land so great. Both Black and white, we love it and live to guard its fate. As one will march together through war, may make its toll. We'll strive for right and justice, our aim a higher goal. From hill and spire and rampart, then let old glory shine. We dearly pay the price with blood. I count its glory mine. This beautiful and patriotic verse comes from a 1939 collection of poetry entitled Echoes from the Hills, composed by Bessie Woodson Yancey. In this poem, Woodson Yancey departs from the familiar code switching African Americans have always had to perform in order to survive in this country. For Paul Lawrence Dunbar, of whom Woodson Yancey had great admiration eloquently penned, African Americans must, quote, wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile. Masking, or a way of being and living in this country that Black folk know oh so well, is a style that Woodson Yancey strives to leave behind so as to shine the light of transparency on the African American experience She talks openly and honestly, something African Americans haven't always had the freedom to do, about what it means to be Black in this country, about the meaning of liberty and democracy and hope, about the agency to create one's own identity, of understanding one's own self and one's own Blackness, ethnicity, and race, not the one imposed upon us from without. She talks about transcending the internalized white gaze, the interior white prison stamped upon Black folk from birth, the double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois famously described that makes us, according to Dunbar, quote, smile, but oh great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. In this talk this evening, I will modulate on the literary styles of Dunbar and Woodson Yancey, ever mindful of the tactical motifs African-American culture has perfected in order to endure in a society hell-bent on our destruction, while yearning towards the hopefulness and ascendancy evident in the more resonant ideals of this country. Bessie Woodson Yancey was the younger sister of the great Carter G. Woodson, founder of what was then called Negro History Week, through the now Association for the Study of African American Life and History, an organization that continues to publish the Journal of African American History. Woodson, it could rightfully be said, is one of the main reasons we have gathered here tonight. As a great scholar and historian who completed his Ph.D. in history, and the second African American to do so at Harvard after, of course, Du Bois himself, Woodson was understandably dismayed at what he called the whitewashing of history. That is the systematic erasure, obfuscation, and denial of the historic Black presence in the study of world civilizations. Woodson was especially worried about the impact this whitewashing would have on the psyches of Black people. The trials that Woodson faced, having institutional doors and academic structures repeatedly slammed in his face due to Eurocentric bias, reminds me of an anecdotal story that the illustrious historian John Henrik Clarke once told. Recounting his childhood attending the country schools of Union Springs, Alabama in the 1920s, and learning all about great Western European historical figures like Constantine, Henry VIII, and Napoleon, Clarke asked his teacher, who were the great Black historical figures? When would the class learn about Black history? Clarke was answered, in no uncertain terms, that no important Black historical figures existed. They couldn't exist, for there was no such thing as Black history. Black people never contributed anything worthwhile to be recounted in history books. The Blacks in Africa were only savages in the jungle, and the Blacks in America had only been slaves. Clarke's teacher, whoever she was, had been only repeating what the well-regarded Enlightenment philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel taught. Africa and Africans have no history, no religion, no government, no morality. The land of Africa, like the people, are undeveloped. Their exploitation and enslavement justifiable. Hegel's 19th century position sounds eerily similar to the writings of a 17th century Islamic traveler, Leo Africanus, who, when faced with an ultimatum by the Pope, promptly converted to Roman Catholicism, and at the urging of this same Pope, crafted the work Description of Africa, which by the mid-17th century had been translated and read thoroughly in every country in Western Europe. This text influenced European views on Africa and Africans for centuries to come. Despite traveling extensively on the continent and even visiting Timbuktu, the famed West African city of Mali, a great educational center and home to dozens of schools of learning and universities, famed for its prodigious output of scholarship by renowned academics of various disciplines. Africanus wrote, quote, "Africans' wits are mean and vile. They observe no certain order of living nor of laws. By nature, they are a base people, being no better accounted of by their governors than if they were dogs. They lead a savage and beastly life. They spend all their days either in most lewd practices, neither wear they any shoes nor garments. The Negroes themselves lead a beastly kind of life, being utterly destitute of the use of reason, of dexterity and wit, and of all arts," end quote. Thanks to Africanus, among others, despite its renown as an academic center, the city of Timbuktu would gradually be ridiculed by early modern Europeans as a ridiculous imaginary place in the farthest reaches of the earth. Africana was in fact dubbed with the moniker Africanus due to his North African heritage, but the tendency to label an individual, quote, Africanus, stems back to the ancient Roman Empire, when military conquerors invaded the continent. The general Scipio Africanus, for example, was awarded with the title for successfully defeating Carthage. In this sense, Leo Africanus, like his earlier one, certainly earned the name, for his writings would go on to help decimate the continent and its people. And as an aside, the word Africanus, given as a moniker for generals who conquered Africa, is not the source of the word Africa, which is a common theme on social media platforms these days. Africanus's writings, published 1 year prior to an infamous edict by Queen Elizabeth I of England, probably influenced her language, which describes Negroes and Blackamoors as, quote, kind, the same word used by Africanus, kind of people who should be removed from the English realm. Robert Gainish, a writer who traveled on slave trading voyages with the man dubbed as Elizabeth's #1 slave trader, John Hawkins, also uses similar language, writing that Negroes are, quote, a people of beastly living without a God, law, religion, or commonwealth. The next two kings of England, James I and Charles I, really got the ball rolling by extending Elizabeth's exploratory trading activities to begin actively buying and selling Africans to work on colonies in the so-called New World. Less than 30 years later, the noted philosopher of democracy, John Locke, saw no contradiction in writing against the tyranny of slavery, which threatened English men, while investing heavily in corporations that continued to commission slave traders to capture Africans and sell them as property to increase wealth. This reflects the power of a story. From Leo Africanus to Queen Elizabeth, to Robert Ganesh, to John Locke, to George Hegel, a story that expresses the inferior nature of a people, a story that justifies their subjugation, a story that is perpetuated throughout time and place, a story that even gets into the hearts and minds of the people it debases. John Henrik Clarke, along with Carter G. Woodson, worked hard by publishing texts on Black history in order to dispel notions propagated by such stories. They used the results of hard research, or what they called, quote, scientific facts, to advocate that public school systems and curricula eradicate Eurocentric bias. They, as well as other pioneering educators, including Mary McLeod Bethune, wrote passionately about Black history, for they understood that when people are kept ignorant about the beauty of their traditions, they consciously and unconsciously learn to despise themselves. Unfortunately, Woodson's celebrated Miseducation of the Negro, published in 1933, served not only as a reflection, but prophecy. Indeed, the same concerns that Woodson had regarding the state of education in the 1930s and 40s continued well into the century, even after the historic 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling of the Supreme Court that desegregated public schools, as well as the fruits of the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination in public life. Black History Week became Black History Month in 1970, the year of my birth. And by the 1976 bicentennial year, Black History Month was celebrated all over the nation. However, I did not personally experience the educational vision that Black leaders like Woodson, Clark, and Bethune had so desperately desired for children like me. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and attended the same school, Central High, where decades before, mobs of whites attacked children for simply trying to attend. My generation was among the youngest who were desegregated into predominantly white educational spaces. I was 3 when I began attending an all-white nursery school, known for its advanced educational philosophy and hands-on approach to the development of young minds. What I remember most, however, is that the white children in my class refused to have anything to do with me. All my recesses and playtimes were spent alone, except for a very short period in which one white boy befriended me. We played together for a few weeks, chasing each other around the monkey bars, building sand castles in the sandbox, frolicking at hide and seek among the bushes. Well, this must have gotten around to the other parents because one day after school, I'll never forget, my friend's father came to pick him up and unceremoniously spanked him in front of the entire class. My friend, and I can't even remember his name, was warned never again to play with the quote, Negro girl. After that, my desegregated educational experience was a blur. I was always obsessed with books, their plots, themes, and characterization. The only problem was none of the characters looked like me. Snow White, Cinderella, Rapunzel, Hansel and Gretel, Jack and Jill. Oh, and once we started learning to read, Dick and Jane. In the 70s edition, that lovely white couple who lived with their dog Spot, cat Puff, and daughter Sally, an entirely white universe, utterly devoid of anyone who looked like me. History books were filled with white knights, rescuing white damsels in distress, while white kings commanded armies and launched shipping vessels to conquer the world as white queens cried into handkerchiefs. Then there were the brave and determined pilgrims who left their homes in search of the freedom to worship their God. These same pilgrims were hounded by menacing Indians, except for that one nice visit at Thanksgiving, but overcame them by manifest destiny to build a just and powerful nation, sea to shining sea. We gleefully sang "My Land is Your Land" in music classes after dutifully reciting the Pledge of Allegiance and reflecting happily that ours was the greatest country in the world. In school, of course, we studied the history of slavery, the horrible transatlantic slave ships on which the Africans, naked, bruised, and battered, were chained together in the bottomless holes and then pushed out to be bought and sold at auction like animals. We rejoiced to learn about a few Black leaders at school. Crispus Attucks, the first man who happened to be of African descent, who died for the cause of the American Revolution. Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass. Still, it was a white savior, we learned, Abraham Lincoln, who set our people free. I actually cheered on my white friends in elementary school and junior high who gave class presentations about their family histories and genealogies. They often had interesting stories about ancestors who came over on ancient ships like the Mayflower. Meanwhile, I silently bemoaned the fact that I had no noble ancestors of which to speak. My ancestral history was one of silence and shame. Our families and churches of the Black church filled in the large gaps left by the schools. Every year during February, we celebrated Black History Month programs where we learned additional details about Martin Luther King, Sojourner Truth, and even folks like Robert Smalls, who commandeered a Confederate ship during the Civil War and saved hundreds of enslaved persons. But the underlying narrative was the same. Masses and masses of Black people were inferior. They had commanded no great armies or great nations or great societies. Sure, some individuals in history had managed to accomplish amazing feats, but the people as a whole, as according to the Scottish philosopher David Hume, were of an inferior nature, an inferior race, biologically lower on the chain of humanity, which accounted for their failure to produce any notable civilization. And this explained why, after February in school, we got back to studying the great events of history: the Italian Renaissance, the English Battle of Hastings, the 100 Years' War, the French Revolution. We ruminated over the military strategies of European armies in the world wars and the brilliant theories which led to the crafting of political systems that birthed modern nation states, a world safe for democracy. What if we had learned as children in school about West African nations like the Ashanti in the Congo, which boasted kings and queens and military commanders who during the 17th and 18th centuries led well-organized and disciplined troops, skilled in infantry and cavalry, troops that brought British, Portuguese, and Dutch armies to their knees? What if we had learned as children in school about the prominent empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, vast landed areas ruled by powerful men and women of wealth and stature, who oversaw complex administrative centers and regional estates, which were in turn run by lower ranking aristocrats and other civil officials, and the maintenance of extensive economies and political systems characterized by international trade, agriculture, and education? We could never have fathomed, having been taught that Christopher Columbus was the first person to discover the New World, that Muhammad ibn Q, the 14th century West African king of Mali, launched hundreds of ships aimed west in a great exploratory venture 1 century before Columbus sailed. Such things never crossed our minds as even possible. We had been conditioned to believe in Black inferiority. All most of us knew about Africa was Tarzan on TV, a show about a white man ruling over Black tribes in the middle of Africa. We also watched TV ads begging for donations to feed starving, naked African children. Our history, we learned, began with slavery, and as kids, we thanked our lucky stars not to have been born on the African continent. In my hood growing up, Black was not something you wanted to be. The color Black was defined as ugly, evil, sinful, demonic. Black meant doom, death, suffering. Blackness was a curse. Even chocolate cake was called devil's food. A major insult was the pot calling the kettle black, and still is, as I recently saw online. And the Blacker you were, it was even worse. To be dark-skinned and Black was a tragedy of epic proportions that folks never let you forget. Oh yes, African Americans were not immune from anti-Blackness. What happens to the psyches of millions of Black children acculturated into educational systems that implicitly teach the evil of Blackness? How does such formation affect cognitive development, brain patterns? How is the will to learn affected, desire to achieve, motivation for success? We all know the story of the children who were selected to choose dolls and chose the Black doll over the white doll, the Black doll symbolizing evil, the white doll symbolizing good. But what was the process of psychological emergence when those same students awoke to realize that they were Black and, as they had been taught to believe, therefore bad? We were trained to self-hate. Could part of the systematic denial and erasure of Black history in curricula and educational institutions lie in a kind of retaliation and reprisal for desegregation, for civil rights? How better to maintain the second-class status of the masses of Black people than by attacking the mind? Even when we study the history of Africa in school, we continue to be robbed of our heritage and our Blackness. All the ancient Egyptians we saw were Black, were white, as was Pharaoh Ramses, Moses, and the Hebrews in the movie The Ten Commandments, which we watch yearly on television around Easter. The physical depictions of Egyptians we saw in our history books were those of Greek and Romanized Egyptians who lived in the country after it had been conquered and invaded by the Macedonian Greeks and Roman Empire, respectively. But we never knew that. We were never shown actual images of the paintings and drawings on temples, monuments, tombs, and pyramids that depicted the native people, the people of the land, as they saw themselves, with Black and brown colored skin. We never saw representations of statuary in which people were presented with African features, noses, although usually lopped off, mouths, body, and bone structure. We didn't see depictions of their African hair, styled in braids, locks, and afros. We didn't see the Afro pits they left in their tombs to style their hair in the afterlife. We didn't see the wigs also left in those tombs and on mummies made up of natural hair. We never learned that Ahmose Nefertari of the 18th dynasty, the ancient Egyptian queen who ruled alongside King Ahmose I, was not only revered as one of the greatest queens in ancient African history, but was depicted with coal Black skin. We never got the chance to marvel at representations of her and hundreds of other images of the ancients in all of their splendid darkness. Instead, we learned about Cleopatra, the last Egyptian monarch who was not even native Egyptian. She was descended from invaders and colonizers, the Ptolemies, a dynasty that went back to the armies of the Macedonian general Alexandria. We also saw a sculpture of Nefertiti, the wife of Akhenaten, with European features, a famous sculpture that experts now say is fake. But we didn't know that. Right now, as we speak, there is a new movie in the works about Queen Cleopatra. Why a new movie? Wasn't the one with Elizabeth Taylor good enough? At the time when Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra was made, it was the most expensive film in cinematic history. How about a new movie about ancient Egypt, this time with a native ancient Egyptian queen? I vote Lupita Nyong'o as Ahmose Nefertari. Or better yet, a movie about Ahmose Nefertari's probable grandmother, Hatshepsut the Great, who commanded the ancient throne of Egypt as king, and whose tactical genius regulated the ancient Egyptian trade networks, thereby stabilizing the wealth and resources of the nation. Or what about the successor Ahmose III to Hatshepsut, who became the greatest military commander in ancient Egyptian history and went on to establish the golden age of the ancient Egyptian empire, which stretched from Kush in the south to Libya in the west to India in the east. The choices are endless. Or is it because these personages and the depictions in which they express themselves are people with Black and brown skin? Please do not let me refrain from mentioning that the word Egypt itself is a Greek corruption of the ancient word Hat Kat Ptah, house of the soul of Ptah, a phrase representing the ancient city of Memphis, a city so glorious that the spellbound Greeks began using a transliteration of the word Het Kat Ptah as Egyptos, representing not just the name of the city, but the entire country. Calling this ancient land Egypt is like future historians calling the United States New York. The people called their name Cam or Kim, Kemet, since the ancient language had no vowels, meaning Black land or land of the Blacks. Incidentally, the word Kim or Kemet is similar to the one the Hebrews use for Egypt, Ham, which in the Hebrew Bible also means Black. Most of us know the story about the curse of Ham, also called the Hamitic myth. We readily accept that when Noah cursed Ham's son Canaan, Blacks were supposedly cursed. In fact, the actual people of Cam, or the people of the Black land, loved Blackness so much it was the color of divinity. In one of their creation stories, the deity Khnum gathers up the Black soil and fashions the Black bodies of the people on the potter's wheel. Then Asar, the god of resurrection, comes and breathes life into their bodies before putting them into their mother's womb. Blackness found in the fertility of the land nourished by the river Nile, reflected the color of the people's bodies. This color was the source of beauty, power, and wealth. Blackness was the essence of their very existence. Their identity is tied to the land, and that very land, with its fertility and bounty, made them the wealthiest people in the ancient world and the most powerful nation for over 5,000 years. Yet, we never knew that, and we still don't. But how might things look if we did? How would the psyche of a young Black child's mind be affected to learn that the people of Kim look like them? That this land, this oldest and greatest civilization in history, the source of mathematics, writings, chemistry, thus originating from the word Kim, physics, astronomy, religion, philosophy, biology, and forerunners of every known discipline, and some we haven't even figured out since modern engineers frustratingly fail to decipher how the pyramids were built, were established all by Black and brown people. What are the implications in learning that all foundational knowledge in Western civilization did not begin with the Greeks? In fact, the ancient Greek philosopher par excellence, Plato himself, writing in the text Timaeus, indicates that his ancient African philosophers in Kemet called him and his fellow Greek students, quote, children in their learning. Apparently, Plato wasn't that great of a student. The Platonic notion of the forms studied in every modern university is simply a version of the ancient Kemetic notion of neter or divinity, which can be roughly translated as transcendence and immanence, a concept immortalized in the Great Sphinx, a monument still standing and yet older than ancient Kemetic civilization itself. But alas, the American educational system, a model for systems the world over, is designed to nurture a sense of Black inferiority. But this is changing. We are living in the information age. a time in which technology provides knowledge at a click. Resources that were kept from students of my generation, resources that were lacking in textbooks and local libraries, can now be found by pulling up a keyboard and tapping. Never before in the history of humanity is such vast information previously inaccessible to the masses, become so readily available. Black and white educators are revolutionizing their teaching content. This includes putting knowledge of Africa and Black history front and center. However, this is a frightful prospect for many. We are experiencing backlash in the form of nationwide bans against cultural race theory. Although an academic methodology based on analyzing structural forms of racism and discrimination, the term has become a signifier for expanding curriculum that teaches about Black history and race in the classroom, that teaches, according to one legislator, Black students to feel superior and white students to feel inferior. For some, this is an invasive threat. The battlefield, as it has always been, is that of the mind. Thus, there is great significance in historically Black colleges and universities around the country being targeted by bomb threats on the first day of Black History Month. The African American mind is under siege. Blacks and whites of goodwill are fighting a battle they may not realize, and yet we always have been. For the true nature of equality, for the true meaning of democracy means that the souls of people are able to flourish without internalized racism, internalized self-hatred, internalized destruction, but are able to flourish by learning and growing and appreciating themselves, their identities, their heritages, their backgrounds, their families. What will we do about it? Will we continue to be lulled into the complacency of media temptations with their bread and circuses? Or will we engage institutions, legislators and legislatures and representatives, as well as Black American churches, to put off the tradition of disengagement and reemerge as resistance makers, as bodies creating those who are seeking liberation, although birthed, as was the Black church, initially in the crucible of slavery? Are we willing to create pockets of knowledge-making centers that teach love of Blackness, glorification of Blackness to confront the demonization of everything Black? Are we willing to create phrases and music and poetry that affirms that Blackness is indeed good, as is whiteness, as indeed all the representations of God's creation? Will we be willing to affirm the truth that Black is love? In conclusion, I like to think that our ancestors are with us. They once embodied in the skins of Blackness and affirming their Blackness in those universes continue to resonate in our souls. And I hear that in the phrase of a poem by Langston Hughes, referring, I believe, to the power of that great river Nile, which infused the red sands of Egypt with the Black silt that rose up to the fertility of a mighty nation. Hughes writes, "I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis, for this rich presentation. And so we're going to open the floor for questions and conversation, if that is okay. Are there questions?
Gives you a little time to process
Yes.
and ingest everything that you've
Yes.
heard.
Indeed. Indeed.
I have a question.
Okay. Is it Gwen?
Gwen.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was trying to catch the name of the king you mentioned that traveled a century before Columbus with the hundreds of ships. I don't know that story. Please share.
Yes. So you may have heard of Mansa Musa, who is given the status of being the wealthiest man in history. Well, according to Mansa Musa, the previous king who had ruled before him prior to Mansa Musa taking the throne was a man by the name of Muhammad ibn Q, and that's IBN-Q. And Muhammad was, of course, as great a king as Mansa Musa, even greater. And Muhammad was impacted by stories that he had heard of the various traders and educators who came through Mali. And he was fascinated with maps and geography, and he wanted to know what lay on the other side of the Great Sea, which in early modern maps, incidentally, is called the Ethiopian Sea. We know it, of course, as the Atlantic Ocean, but it was known in the ancient world as an African Sea or the Ethiopian Sea. And according to Mansa Musa, this previous king pulled together a huge body of ships and prepared them with food and provisions for months to travel across the ocean. And they waited and waited for weeks for this king to return. And then when he never returned, Mansa Musa would go on to rule. And we know from other narratives and other stories, particularly the work of the scholar Ivan van Sertima, that there is historical evidence of very dark-skinned people, African people in what we call Mesoamerica, Central America, and even in the writings of Christopher Columbus himself, he writes of encountering different groups of people, but one particular group of people he describes encountering that he describes them as looking as like Africans, like very, very dark-skinned people. So this is just one of the stories and anecdotes that come from that time period and associated with Mansa Musa.
What dates could you assign to those?
So that would be in the 14th century, 1300s.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other questions or thoughts? I know it was a lot of information to digest.
That's me, yeah, historian. One of the comments I wanted to make about the African American church, and in particularly thinking about the issue in relation to cultural race theory, I wasn't sure if we'd have enough time. So one of the comments I wanted to make about the African American church and the issue of the separation of church and state is that the African American church is a movement that was born in resistance. It was born in slavery. And part of the propaganda that would be would be spread in concert with people that are philosophizing, to use that word, in the 16th and 17th centuries, people like David Hume and John Locke, developing this Enlightenment notion as they're developing these pseudo-scientific categories of humanity, that Africans are not fully human, right? And that because of their lack of humanity, and we see this even in the writings of someone like Leo Africanus, that is relegating Africans to being a little bit above beast, that they don't have souls or they don't have spirits, like animals. So they have no religion. And this is one of the ideas that were propagated about Africans. So the idea that Africans could be Christian or even Muslim was considered preposterous to the enslavers. And what they would begin to do, of course, would be to prevent people of African descent from converting to Christianity. And this leads to a whole missionary movement in which European missionaries would work to convince enslavers that Africans could be converted to Christianity and their souls could be liberated while their bodies remained in chains, right? So there was a really conflicting notion of salvation and the notion of theology that was available to enslaved Africans. But the version of Christianity that early Africans received who were enslaved was that God had designed their enslavement. They were inferior beings. They were supposed to be enslaved, which was God's will for them. So the Black church, which emerged in the context of the plantations as enslaved people heard these messages, was a theology that reversed that understanding. It rejected the fact or that idea that Africans were inferior and affirmed their true equality and their true worth as the beloved of God. So by definition, the African-American church born in slavery was a resistance movement, right? Because it challenged the mainstream understanding and doctrine that was being propagated to the enslaved. However, centuries after when emancipation did come, the Black church continuing to be the center of identity and personhood and community for the Black population and continuing to be the site of resistance, Jim Crow laws succeeded in really creating this separation between church and state. So where that you had the crossing of the politicalization, the agitation, the resistance of the status of Black Americans that began in slavery and was active, for example, in the abolitionist movement, active in the Underground Railroad, there was a silencing because of the lynchings and all of the suffering and oppression that Blacks had to undergo. So they essentially cut off overwhelming numbers, cut off that politicalization and essentially became the silent Christian institution that some associate with the Black church. So the question of the separation of church and state in the Black church, as well as American Christianity broadly, is that there has been essentially, in terms of ideology, no real separation. There's always been political advocacy that has taken place in the church, whether conservative churches or whether Black churches. But the question is that will the Black church reclaim that spirit of advocacy and politicalization that exists in our world and find ways to, and continue to find ways to openly resist the attack that Black people are experiencing in our minds through lack of education, lack of access to knowledge, et cetera. So that was the part that I wasn't sure if that we'd have time to discuss. So just wanted to put that information about the Black church out there. But I think that there was a question.
There was. Judge Tobin had his hand up.
Hello there and good evening, Doctor.
Hello.
Thank you so much for an enriching and informative presentation. Ironically, I am teaching a class in our Global Leadership Ph.D. program where we this week have been focused on separation of church and state. We had a most unusual opportunity in that one of our students is an Egyptologist.
Wow.
Some of his time in Alexandria and some of his time here. And he said, what's really interesting about Egypt is that from about the 4th century to about 600 AD, it was all Christian.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you could have knocked over every student with a feather.
Interesting.
My point is this. I also teach negotiation, and so frames, perspectives are absolutely essential. Having grown up, as you might see, I'm an old white guy. Spent my first teenage years in Northern California, then in Wisconsin, and the next 30 in Kentucky. And after I got over my cultural whiplash, I recognized that what I had come to accept as one history was completely unacceptable in a new area. My point is, we grow up with things being a certain way, and it gives us comfort.
Right.
And yet, when we thought as a child, we looked upon things as a child. As we got older, I see where Sutter's Fort, not far from where I grew up, has completely changed their presentations. And they are now talking about the trading in slavery that John Sutter did with the native Californians. And there is movement to take down the iron bells marking the old El Camino Real. Change is necessary. Change is terrifying.
Yes.
I wonder if in a passion to push back against change, some of our colleagues, particularly in the Midwest and the deeper South, they may acknowledge the invalidity of what we grew up with, but it's so hard to give up. What's a pathway that we as educators, how can we try and take the fear out of change and put what we as educators know is the value of change, the new information seen in a new perspective? And for me, in a class where I have students, I literally have students from Africa, from China, from Lebanon, and from America, you know, that other part of the country outside the People's Republic. And I joy in those mixed experiences. But every now and again, how can I best serve them? You have focused some time on this. I would appreciate just a little advice.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your question. I think that's a very powerful question. And I think it's at the heart of what many of the issues are around cultural race theory today, and why there is so much controversy in the media sphere, in the public marketplace, and definitely in school boards and so forth. People are terrified, but there is necessary for us to think about the root of the fear. What is the root of the fear? And it's not simply just that there is change, because we know that change is inevitable, and we all have to look forward to changing. We change in our own personal lives, and you know, it's a part of life. But there is a particularly rooted fear in this issue because it has to do with the historical establishment of power, how power has been arranged historically in this country. And the fact that you had a particular mass of people who were historically disenfranchised, who were historically powerless. And this was beneficial to the economic arrangement, because there was the ability to utilize the masses for their labor in ways that benefited the larger economy and not those groups. So the issue of power being rooted in the subjugation of a particular group of people means that if we are to look at rearranging the way that group of people have been taught and conditioned and socialized to see themselves as inferior and subjugated, even in the modern day, it means that we have to anticipate a change eventually, maybe not initially, but a change in the way power is arranged. And this terrifies people, right? It isn't just change, but the nature of the change. And so part of the conversation then needs to be around how we think about power, the perception of power. And you're right, how we perceive power, like how we perceive influence, how we perceive the just distribution of resources, right? You know, how do we think about ourselves as a collective, as a community, as individuals and groups, and how those groups fit together, right? And if we really take seriously the ideals of democracy, the ideals of equality, the ideals of liberation, then we have to make radical decisions about how resources and power are distributed in our country. And it means that there are going to be changes in the ways that individuals come to inhabit and occupy certain realms of power. And these are the conversations that I think a lot of us are not willing to have. And this is what is terrifying.
Couldn't agree more.
So that's where we stand. And that's why so much is at stake. And this is why institutions and legislatures are fighting so hard.
Thank you for taking my
question.
question.
Thank you so much for your question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Are there other questions tonight? Again, it's a lot to take in. A lot of other people may be formulating questions. I wonder how, as educators and leaders, we might think about helping people become more curious.
Yes.
When the framework of called whiteness has been the center focal point of everything and been the starting point, how do we invite people to be curious about something else?
That's an excellent question, because I struggle with that in teaching where I teach in my institution, particularly because we've been so deeply socialized into the way that we perceive the world that it isn't seen as something that we need to address. All is right with the world. So what would it look like? And this is kind of a fantasy idea. What would it look like for the range of movies that we have to choose from on Netflix, right? That are historical movies. Movies that are usually about English, French, Greek history. What would it look like to have choices, about other kinds of films? These are the kinds of stories that elicit interest. I think that we have to put it out there, right, in our teaching, even including it as an, anecdotal information, even as melding it into the kinds of things that we're talking about. We're talking about Platonic philosophy, to talk about the antecedents of Platonic philosophy, right? It doesn't emerge, just completely, fully formed without influences. And what are some of those? And something like the Sphinx or something like the pyramids are great cultural markers for us. We're aware of these cultural markers, but may not know much about the philosophical systems that contributed to the development of these physical structures. And yet we think of, okay, this is the beginning of philosophy, of human thought, Plato, Aristotle, and those ideas. And so I think that we have to introduce them in ways. We have to do our own work to educate ourselves in ways that we were not necessarily taught. Material that was not necessarily part of our curriculum, that was not necessarily, put in front of us. We have to do that additional research. So it's true that we are in the information age, and you can have access, even the digitized copies of, primary sources. As a historian, you have, pictures of these that you can look online. So you have access to all of this information, but you have to know what you're looking for. You have to know that it's out there. If you don't know that the material even exists, or this particular subject matter even exists, you won't know to look for it. And so part of the challenge, I think, is researching, but ideally what I would imagine is think tanks of educators who would gather together, like in forums or caucuses, to discuss varying aspects of history and knowledge that we just weren't even aware of. And this goes for teachers who are trying to add to their curriculum and craft curriculum and make their curriculum more diverse, having the opportunity either to attend conferences or be in conversation with groups who are working together to mine all of the resources. This is not even just for thinking broadly about Black history, but also in thinking in terms of women's history, thinking in terms of various aspects of history that is just left out of core curriculums, and how core curricula, and how if you don't take a specialized course, a specialized course devoted to a particular subject, but if you're just getting your major credits, you're going to miss out on this additional information. So we find ways to be in communication with each other and share this knowledge.
I think it's interesting that everything kind of gets encapsulated in, maybe 500 to 1,500 years worth of history, Western facing, when there were civilizations long before that. And we have an Arabic numeric system, not a Roman.
Yes.
System, but no one questions that.
No one questions that. No one questions that. I think that's really, really significant. So one of the anecdotes that I like to share is, even in this country, it's something very familiar to us when we say Black Friday. Why do we say Black Friday, which is the day after Thanksgiving? What makes it Black? And normally Black in this culture is bad, right? So, like a Black Day, Black Sunday, kind of, it means something terrible happened. But Black Friday usually means, I guess, a positive thing in the sense that you're going to go shopping, you're going to, there are a lot of deals, you're going to get, a lot of material things that you wanted. But what is the source of something, being Black in terms of, finances, and why is something considered to be in the Black, and why is something considered to be in the red? So Black essentially means like profit, and it means, credit. And it actually goes back to, when you mention the Arabs, it made me think about the Moors and their Arabic influence in medieval Europe. And, they brought their numerical system, but they also brought with that the ledgers that in which they would divide the credit side and the deficit side. So the credit side was Black, and the deficit side was red. So as you would balance your accounts, if you were on the profit or the credit side, it would be in black. And then if it were in the deficit side, it would be in red. And so where does this idea come from? Like, why is black considered, credit and red considered deficit? Believe it or not, it goes to ancient Kemet. So in ancient Kemet, the black land, as I discussed in the talk, the black land was associated with fertility. And in the ancient world, even before the building of the civilization, when the rivers would inundate the area, I mean, this was a matter of life and death, because the inundation of the black silt meant life. Adjacent to the black silt was the red land or the sand. So if you happen to be in proximity to the black land, that meant fertility, growth. That means there's foliage. That means you can find food. You can find water, you can find resources. Whereas the further you go out into the red land in the desert, that means death. And so the symbolism of black as fertility and good and wealth, and red as death and suffering was actually a geographical motif. And even in ancient Kemet, Asar, who was called the Great Black, was a deity who was killed by his red brother, who was called Set. And Set and his redness would be adopted by other civilizations. And this is where we get Satan. And this is why Satan is often characterized as red. So, right, these are just the kind of stories and reflections and anecdotes that we learn when we do our research and we do the work, expanding, the things that we've been taught. We sort of been taught this, this basic curriculum. And just as you said, there are a lot of things that we just accept through Western education that we don't question, that it's just, for example, we never question or think about the fact that it was the Arabic Moors who brought chess into Europe, and who even borrowed in their earlier iterations of that game that come from ancient Africa, right? So we sort of just, at least I did growing up, thought of chess as just a European game. It didn't occur to me that it had roots outside of Europe. So for many, that's interesting information. It kind of widens the, horizons to think broader about contributions of society in addition to Western Europe. Western Europe has just dominated, our whole horizon for so long that we don't have a consciousness that, wow, there's so many other, ancient civilizations and societies that have contributed knowledge and information that we use every day, but we don't realize it. And instead we have a debased view of groups that are often outside of Western Europe.
Yes, thank you. I want to acknowledge that we have a note in the chat from Sue Ellen. She says, Tamara, thank you so much for sharing your story and all your knowledge with us. I'm glad I attended this session today. I have to go, but before I go, I'd like to say God bless you to continue spreading your amazing message. I'm not from the US, and today I learned a lot with you. Thank you.
Oh, that's so nice.
So, are there other questions or comments or thoughts as we've listened?
So Dr. Lewis, thank you for such an incredible conversation today. One of the struggles I tend to have in my classes, because I do teach, I teach an overview of critical race theory. I also touch on some of the topics around the diaspora. One of the things I struggle with is where if you had to direct me somewhere to gain more information and just to educate myself even more on how to elevate our community of color across the board, regardless of background, but where would you say I should start? And I go to all the traditional routes, right? So the literature and things like that, but some of this information is so fascinating, and I would love to integrate it into my teaching. So any suggestions would be greatly appreciated.
So that's an excellent question. And I think that represents the state of where we are because, unfortunately, even when I think about the work that I've done, it's just like compiling from all of these sources. There's not enough work where we're pulling all of these things together. So a lot of my interest, I think Judge is still there. My interest or my work by trade is actually as a professor of the history of Christianity, right? And so I was trained in the history of Christianity, so I'm very familiar with Christian Egypt in the early church and so forth. But the problem for me is that, I had so many questions that in the material was not addressed, right? And so there's so many questions that forced me to have to go do further and additional research. The fact is, though, is that I had to go to primary sources, right? There are a number of texts that talk about ancient Africa that I could recommend you to. And what is liberating about those texts is that even though they're about ancient Africa, they kind of open you up to the world because so many of these core ideas originate in ancient civilizations, and ancient Africa, ancient Samaria, ancient Kemet, ancient Samaria, but they're the majority primary sources. We have to do a better job of, at this point of scholarship in pulling together the resources and writing about them because they have been so ignored in modern day scholarship. So I mentioned John Henrik Clarke, another Senegalese scholar who is extraordinary, of course, is Cheikh Anta Diop. DIOP. His works are very helpful. He has a number of texts. One is on ancient Kemet, and the other is on pre-colonial African societies, which teaches us a lot about the culture of the continent of Africa before colonization, and helps us understand various aspects of their political systems, their religion, aspects of their technology, their industry. So you have a lot of anecdotal work there, but you got to, sort of mine that material because it's a lot, sort of like my presentation today. It's just like a lot of stuff because you find so much has been ignored that you want to just pull it all together. But I would encourage you to go a little off the grain, to look at texts like Diop, look at texts like Clarke, and Ivan Van Sertima is another one. These are the scholars who were totally dismissed in the late 50s and 60s, as you can imagine. When they came out, they were dismissed from, mainstream schools because they represented, the Eurocentric perspective. But their research has had staying power. So it will require some work, but those would be good starting points. It's not all put together, unfortunately. This is a field that, as someone stated in the comments, very important. And if it's an infant, it's still in the womb, right? It's very, very early.
Well, that's actually really helpful. It gives me a starting point. And as Charlotta is aware, I'm always curious. I'm always engaging in the conversation, although she is known to have these really phenomenal questions that don't have answers, but we can engage in the conversation.
Of course. Yes.
So
exactly.
Definitely appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to acknowledge that Florence Valentine wrote, "Thank you so much for sharing your work. I enjoyed your lecture." Just so that we're getting to some of the messages here in case you're missing them. The other thing I'm thinking about, as you and Dr. Gabby were discussing, is what would it look like for us to begin putting together a bibliography?
Yes, yes.
For scholars to begin kind of doing the work and, maybe us starting to annotate some of it, right? So that it's in one place, people can go get it, but that we've got all these different angles and these different kind of areas that speak to the history of who we are and what has shaped and molded us from the most diverse space that we can think of at this particular point and conceptualize. But what better place to begin thinking about that than with a bunch of scholars in the room to start that conversation. Everyone comes from a particular sphere of expertise that eventually touches.
Right. Well, I think that's excellent. And if it's okay with you, Charlotta, I have a number of bibliographies and that I work with. A lot of them are texts that come from like independent publishers, right? Because you've had a lot of scholars who again, find that work off the grid. It's not popular in many groups. I mean, even this idea of the ancient Kemetic people being Black is deeply contested, right? It's deeply contested in Egyptology. It's deeply contested even in modern Egypt. It's really, really a controversial issue. And I've even found that even going into spaces and we've been so deeply conditioned to think of Black as evil that even when I go into spaces and talk about Blackness is divinity, this is shocking for people. People reject it, people don't like it because you've been so nurtured, even implicitly in our Christian tradition. When we talk about divinity, or we talk about God, it's the light dispelling the darkness, right? The darkness is bad, the darkness is evil, the light is good, so you have this polarization of these ideas. And it's sometimes it's hard for people to kind of reorient their thoughts into thinking along these lines. So I've read texts that they're texts that even you can find, for example, in some libraries, but most of the time in Amazon, for example, Black contributions to world history, like follow texts along these themes, which include a lot of gathered information that is not acceptable in mainstream. But yes, I definitely could contribute to a working bibliography.
That would be great.
That again, a lot of the texts off the grid, independent publishers, earlier texts from scholars who were not recognized by the academy at the time, but their work has staying power. Because when you do the research and when you look at the primary sources, the information checks out. So it makes us realize that history and scholarship is political, right? It's political. It's not. We think, scholarship is but often there's a lot of politics that goes into what is deemed proper or correct scholarship sometimes. So you have to be aware of that, I think.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, the work of Jacob Carruthers, the work of Francis Quest Wellesley, those are all names that don't come up in mainstream, but, that speak to ancient Kemet and other places and other work. Even the work of Derek Bell, even though we know the name, it's not, well, some of us know the name, but it's not work that is, is there for people to kind of wrestle with.
Right.
We have a few more minutes. And I want to make sure I've gotten to anyone else's questions or thoughts on this before we close out. Just in closing out, like the question aspect of this, as we move forward, right? Some of us are, finishing our PhDs or midway through. Others are, teaching and professors. Words of wisdom on navigating the realities of a very divided space and running into people's master narratives that when you challenge them, it completely derails anything that they can believe about themselves and the world. How do we navigate that as honestly, authentically, and cautiously, with dignity and respect for people's humanity, as we possibly can, because we are in a divided space.
That is an amazing question. That is an amazing question. So the fact of the matter is, we still operate in this divided space, and we also have to be mindful of the fact that, the power brokers, still, were trained with the master narrative. So that's just reality. So as a PhD student, or preparing for your future, it's important for you to be deeply conversant and deeply trained in the master narratives, believe it or not. I mean, you need to know the master narrative, even if just to also be able to put it in conversation with these other elements. But you need to know the master narrative. One, because it makes you marketable, and it makes you able to perform the kind of teaching and, to have that foundation. But it also makes you deeply conversant with the master narrative, and helps you to be able to deconstruct aspects of the narrative when you are able to put that alongside with these other frameworks that have been ignored, right? And the ideal would be to have those two or various frameworks in conversation with each other, right? And to allow them to dialogue and interact with each other, and and to grow and to build on that basis. But as you said, considering how divided our world is, it's just important. It's just like, as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, in the African American culture, being able to code switch, right? So we can, you can speak, the mainstream language, but you can also speak the other language, and at times you can bring them together, right? So it really has to do with fluidity. It has to do with being multilingual, bilingual, and multilingual, but being able to speak all of the languages separately very well, right? So even if you have to speak one language for a while, you do that extremely well, and you know the other languages very well, and then ultimately you can bring them all together.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming to join us for our inaugural event here at the center, and for all of our guests for being here tonight. We appreciate you taking time out of your schedules to be with us. I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Asia, for some announcements about our upcoming event.
All right. Thank you so much, Charlotta. Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis, for being on today. It's been such a great conversation that we've had. So in the chat, if you all notice, I have put a link to our form. We would love for you to please fill out the Google form, give us some feedback. What did you think about the session? And any other information you'd like for us to have regarding today's keynote. Now, I do want to quickly share the screen with all of you. Actually, give me 1 second. I want to make sure that I have the screen up. And so, because, if I share something, it's going to be like, wait, you're not showing the right thing. Okay, so we do have our Black History Month speaker series. We are still going to be, doing this throughout the rest of the month of February, because we want to really celebrate Black History Month. And with that said, we have our two speakers coming Monday, February 7th. And if you would like to sign up for these, the first one will start at 3:00 p.m. Pacific time with our very own Dr. Calvin Bonds. He's one of our Pepperdine University Graduate School of Education Psychology alums, and he will be talking about his journey towards leadership. And at 5:00 of the same day, on the 7th, 5:00 p.m. Pacific, 8:00 Eastern, we will be having Cracking the C-Suite Code for Black Leaders. And this is going to be hosted, or this is going to be presented by our very own Dr. Clarence Caldwell. He is he's one of our faculty here, and he is also one of our alums here at the GCEP Center. And in addition, we will be continuing with Black History Month Speaker Series on Tuesday, February 8th, 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern, with Dr. Donta Morrison, who will be speaking on the importance of Black history, not only as a month, but also as an ongoing educational tool for Americans of all ages. On Wednesday, February 9th, we have Dr. Jayani Sly, who will be speaking on the topic Black Educators Matter. She will be speaking at 3 o'clock Pacific, 6 o'clock Eastern, and she will be talking about the impact educators have on their students in the K-12 system and beyond. She's one of our alums and also is in the Doctor of Philosophy in Global Leadership and Change program here at Pepperdine. And the following week, Tuesday, February 15, we have Asia Abreu-Brubieska-Hiren. She will be talking about leadership confidence, how to survive being the first and only. She is an alumnus, actually, of Pepperdine University. I didn't know that until I found out just about a couple of weeks ago. She graduated, her undergrad is with Graziadio Business School, actually. So she graduated a while ago, and she's going to be here speaking to us about leadership. And then on the 16th, on Wednesday at 5 o'clock p.m., 8 o'clock Eastern, we will have Dr. LaShonda Johnson, who is a professor and is one of our alums, as well as one of our current PhD students here at GCEP. She'll be talking about Black Women Leaders Matter, Keys to Success for Black Women Leaders in Higher Education. You can sign up for all of these by going to our link here, and I will go ahead and I will share that in the chat again for all of you. So you can go ahead and sign up on our Linktree page. Go ahead and sign up for all of our events if you would like. And if you want to get more information, you can also reach out to myself about these events or to Charlotta at any time. With that said, I would like to see, Dr. Gabby, do you have any words that you would want to say?
I just want to thank everyone for coming, for being here today. The center is very much appreciative of everyone's contribution, everyone's participation, and hopefully we can continue to provide access to information and the opportunity to continue to provide value to GSEP. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you all for coming. And again, Dr. Lewis, thank you very much for such an insightful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.